Very, very pleased to welcome onto the program today Mr. Pearce Robinson. He's a seasoned development diplomat and strategic advisor with more than 2 decades of experience shaping policy, governance reform, and international negotiations across the UK, Africa, Asia Pacific, and the Caribbean. His work with institutions such as the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the G20, the World Conference on Religions for Peace, and the Commonwealth Secretariat has placed him at the center of some of the most complex development and geopolitical conversations of the last 20 years. As chairman of Scarlet 41, he convenes governments, multilaterals, and private sector leaders to drive trade, deepen regional integration, and elevate youth leadership, ensuring that small states and emerging regions have a credible voice in global decision making. So he's joining us today as we unpack the fast moving triangle between Venezuela, the United States of America, and Trinidad and Tobago. And I can tell you one thing, ooh, honey child, as we say here on this program, it's a mess, right? What does it mean for regional security, energy, and the Caribbean zone of peace posture? Well, let's go ahead and put our virtual hands together for Mr. Pearce Robinson. Good morning, good morning, good morning, sir. I'm going to turn my camera on, and you can feel free to turn yours on as well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I was introduced, we have so many Caribbean people all over the world and so many connections all over the world, but we have a little group that I set up a few years ago, Caribbean Connection. And in that group, I was talking about what's happening in the region, and we are concerned. We have Miss Jacqueline Charles. She is a writer for the Miami Herald, very, very well respected in her coverage, especially of Haiti. She does some amazing articles there, as we always keep an eye on that situation. But, lots of people are keeping an eye on what's happening in Trinidad, Venezuela, and of course, the role that the United States is now playing in this whole situation, right? As they try to make movements which look like, in real terms, they're going to be trying to start a war with Trinidad. My apologies, with Venezuela. And so, the Caribbean tensions are high, and we live, whether we realize or not, we live in the Caribbean, and it's not that far off. So Ms. Zara Burton, who's also a journalist stationed out of Jamaica, she sent us one of your articles and said, you know what, you should reach out to Pearce. He does really, really amazing work, and perhaps have him come on your show. So I'm so pleased that we were able to make this connection. And, I thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, my goodness, I feel like the first question is almost a where do we begin question, because it's very, very concerning what we see the President of the United States of America attempting to do as it relates to Trinidad. What is your overall view on what is happening with the U.S. And Venezuela? My apologies, I keep saying Trinidad. But as we do a deep dive today, what is your view on really what is happening, generally speaking?
I think before I sort of get into that, I think perhaps we need to go back a little bit further.
Okay.
And look at 1999. That's when President Hugo Chavez was elected on an anti-establishment platform, right? He at that point got quite a considerable majority, and he rewrote Venezuela's constitution to sort of centralize power, right? At that point, prior to Hugo Chavez, the United States and Venezuela would have enjoyed quite a significant relationship in terms of oil, electricity, steel, and so on. And his election particularly reduced the US footprint in there, because he was saying that all this money is being pummeled out of Venezuela, but nothing is going to the people. So he redirected all of those revenues, nationalized rather, the oil companies and so on, and pumped that into social programs. He cut preferential access for United States firms and built alternative energy alliances. And that is the point at which, there was a catalyst change, right?
Mm,
He was denouncing U.S. foreign policy and sort of famously at the United Nations in 2006, he would have
mm,
said to George Bush, he was the devil, right? That was a famous sort of
mhm,
a statement there. And, so when you look at that accusation of imperialism and colonialism and stuff, that is where we have to start, right? Because
mhm,
that was the point at which the relationship changed. Then he
mm,
built those rival alliances
mhm,
with Cuba, Russia, Iran, China, and now we see that those states are sort of an axis threat to US foreign policy.
mm,
And so, from a geopolitical perspective,
mhm,
this is where things start to shimmy, as it were. And so, when I wrote that opinion piece for Zara Burton at 18 Degrees North, I was looking at Trinidad and Tobago's recent positioning within CARICOM, which is really quite a big talking point at this time, because Zara asked me a few questions, which I didn't really consider at the time because I was more
mhm,
focused on Trinidad and Tobago and what it means. But from a wider regional perspective, I think Zara wanted me to pare down a little bit more on what that means for Jamaica and by extension, the Caribbean region. And I'll talk about Cayman Islands as well, because you might not think, Cayman Islands is out of it. You
mm,
all haven't really said anything, but actually, this is quite critical to the Cayman Islands too, because we're looking at how that intersects with, the escalating U.S.-Venezuela tensions and what
mhm,
downstream effects it has on the implications it has for the rest of the region. Things
mhm.
like tourism, insurance, aviation, and so on, right?
Yes.
So I want to pare down on that a little bit,
Mhm,
because when it pertains to the Cayman Islands, for example, and tourism as a whole, for lots of Caribbean people looking at this, people who own guest houses and whatnot, this is the things that we have to consider, right? When
mhm,
the narrative is that there's an armada in the region, and we're paring down and encircling Venezuela, which is, geographically, you can't really encircle Venezuela, but, we're encircling Venezuela and so on. What
mm,
do tourists here?
mm,
What do tourists here? They're not looking at the Caribbean as Trinidad and Tobago and
mhm,
Venezuela. They're looking at the Caribbean as the region,
mhm.
right? And so when we're looking at what it means, is that the Caribbean is being assessed as one risk space.
Yes.
And so if indeed there is an escalation of tensions and that ultimately turn into land strikes,
Mhm,
look at what has happened thus far between Venezuela, and of course you have planes that are turning off their
mhm,
transponders. We had two near misses, which I highlighted in my article,
mhm,
out
mhm,
of Curacao, where people have literally nearly died because of collisions with US military aircraft that are hiding their locations.
mhm, mhm.
And that is the risk, that airlines, insurers, and
Yes.
people are looking at as a whole. Because when these military flights are coming down from, the United States, they're using the region's airspace, right? When
Mhm,
you look at Flight Radar 24, and you can actually see this live, especially when you have a subscription, you're seeing flights over Jamaica, flights coming down to Trinidad, flying over Barbados. This is the risk. And then on top of that, you have Venezuela as well. They're jamming GPS. We have lots of
mhm,
states in the region talking about GPS failures and how dangerous it is. They can't find where they're going, and so they need to do so
mhm.
manually. They need to look outside the window. This is the risk profile
Yes.
that the region faces.
Yeah.
And
And I'm so glad, Pierce, that you included that, because I know how Caymanians think. And I know a
mhm,
lot of them are sitting back this morning thinking, what does this have to do with me? Why is Sandy having this conversation on Christmas Eve of all days? We'd rather be sitting here talking about Cayman style beef. But this is exactly why you've broken it down so incredibly eloquently and precisely as to why we all need to be concerned. This isn't just a Venezuela problem. This isn't just a Trinidad problem. And this certainly isn't just a US problem. This would impact us in an extremely significant way. And that's why I'm hoping that MP Kenneth Bryan can join us on the program this morning, because one of the things he did yesterday is he did reach out to both the premier and the governor, asking some questions about, you know, really this regional tension and what does it mean for us and whether or not we can expect any sort of a statement from the FCO, because it is very, very alarming. So I don't want to be an alarmist, but I think we need to be a realist. We need to understand what the overall implications are for the entire region and even beyond, because now we see, as President Trump has made it extremely clear that he will be making movements towards Venezuela. You know, he's got 25% of his Marine fleet now in the area. This looks like war. All indicators are that he is prepared to have a war. We now see Russia and China likewise standing up and saying, wait a minute, we're going to take a side in this. We are prepared to support Venezuela. Cuba, right next door to us, I mean, literally, right? They will also have to, no doubt, get into the mix. And I think we should already know that, you know, chances are Cuba is going to be, I don't think they've necessarily said anything publicly yet, but from what we know historically about Cuba's relations, they will no doubt be on the side of Venezuela as well. So lots of things being unpacked. Jamaica is now involved, so we can talk about that here in just a second. We see some movements within CARICOM, where the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago is making some really interesting movements, even in terms of her recent decision. This is KAMLA Persad. I don't know. Is it
Bisasa.
Bisasa, right. So she has been criticizing other countries in the region, such as Antigua and Barbuda, for example, and she makes accusations against the Caribbean community in CARICOM that they're aligning themselves with this Maduro, what she calls narco government. And those were her exact words. She said, aligning itself with the Maduro narco government. Let's talk about what this is really about, because I thought it was so interesting that she made that comment of this being about a narco government, when we clearly see now, if you had any doubts about why the U.S. was doing this, I think in the last couple of weeks, especially after they pardoned, President Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras, I think anyone with a little bit of common sense can recognize that this has nothing to do with them being a narco government.
Yep. And in fact, I just want to point out that the U.S. intelligence community would have identified and assessed where the drugs are coming from, particularly the thing that started this whole thing, which is the scourge of fentanyl that's coming into the United States. The U.S. intelligence community said that there is no evidence that the Maduro administration is, the leader of that, and in fact, the fentanyl is coming from Mexico.
Exactly.
Right? There are routes that pass through Venezuela, but that's on to like Europe and Africa. The primary route going into the United States is via Mexico, Mexico and Colombia and so on, via the Pacific Ocean. So not even on this side of the space. But I just want to take a step back, because generally speaking, on my page, I'm very harshly critical of politicians in Trinidad and Tobago, right? But I just want to take off, just be a little bit balanced here for a second, and be a little bit fair to Prime Minister Persad Bisasa. Genuinely, I believe that her instinct is to protect Trinidad and Tobago, and that, of course, is understandable, because we can't ignore the fact that we have, even up to yesterday, we have, the Venezuelan justice minister and so on, hurling threats, indicating, of course, that if our country is going to be used as a launch pad, Trinidad and Tobago will not be spared. And this has been stated more than 5 times. So there is indeed a real risk of our country
Mhm.
being attacked, right?
Mhm.
And so, as Prime Minister, dealing with such a reality
Mhm.
against the backdrop of U.S. intelligence, whether people believe it or not, because of WMDs in Iraq, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
we have being described in December by Secretary of State Marco Rubio that not only is the Maduro regime illegitimate and dangerous,
Mhm.
but he cited criminal networks, sanctions, evasions, and hostile actors that are part and parcel of that
Mhm.
administration. We're talking about Hezbollah, Iran, the IRGC, and so on. These are the things that is prompting the posture, as it were, with Marco Rubio. But
Mhm.
I just want to make a little bit of a link here, right? Marco Rubio has historically had an issue, particularly with the Cuban administration that you would have mentioned earlier. So we
Mhm.
cannot look at his foreign policy in isolation of
Mhm.
his historical trend. And that is that having been exiled, as it were, from Cuba, his family and so on, he has wanted now to dismantle the Cuban regime and, of course, all of its partners that are propping the regime up and
Mhm.
promulgating, as it were, a situation that allows them to continue baiting, right? In a
Yes.
situation where he thinks that members of the Cuban community are being silenced and political prisoners and whatnot. I just needed to point that out because
Mhm.
we're then able to see where this is heading and who are the people talking into the ears of the President of the United States.
Mhm.
But again,
Yes.
this has been a historical pattern,
Mhm.
right? Because we also have Marshall Billingsley, former assistant treasury person in the United States.
Mhm.
I think that was under Biden, the Biden administration, says that the Maduro government is propped up by organized crime, illicit finance, that the Iranians are giving them drones in exchange for
Mhm.
gold. So we have seen the war in Ukraine,
Mhm.
right? We've
Mhm.
seen uh, both Russia and Ukraine sending drones and it doing untold damage to the civilian population.
Mhm.
Thousands dead. So we here in the
Mhm.
Caribbean must take this seriously,
Mhm.
right? And I know that it's Christmas Eve and we need to be talking good cheer and stuff, but this is our reality.
Mhm.
There are people in the world in the Middle East who face this daily, and they can speak to us
Mhm.
about the trials, the tribulations, and the lasting
Yes.
effects regionally,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So I just wanted to set that to say that I
Yes.
understand the Prime Minister's, uh, you know, you know, need to want to protect Trinidad and Tobago because a fact that most people don't know is
Mhm.
we don't only sit at the southernmost tip of the Caribbean archipelago, right? But actually, we are closer to Venezuela with the Gulf of Paris than we are to Tobago, right? And
Mhm.
people don't know this, right? So when we talk about threats,
Mhm.
when we talk about
Mhm.
missiles, it will
Mhm.
take, depending on if it's supersonic or whatever, the
Mhm.
mere seconds to reach us and to cause untold damage. And so in the Gulf of Paria, you have two
Mhm.
channels, right? One is called the Dragon's Mouth. In Venezuela, it's called Boca del Dragon.
Mhm.
And to the north, we have the Serpent's Mouth,
Mhm.
which is the Boca del Serpente in the south, right? So we have the
Mhm.
Dragon's Mouth and then the Serpent's Mouth. Those are
Mhm. Mhm.
actual channels between Trinidad and Tobago, and they sound dire, a serpent and a dragon. But that is exactly what we have in our two channels. And that's why it's called the Dragon Gas Deal, because it's in the
Mhm.
dragon's mouth. Okay. And so people don't know this about how close we are and so on, but these things are very important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I mean, it's just so fascinating. I did not actually know when you talked about the proximity, and of course, I just have pulled up this map here so that we can get a little visual of what exactly you're talking about. But the main, they're two completely separate islands, right? So we
Yes,
have Trinidad and Tobago, and
correct,
then Venezuela is over here on the map. But you're
correct,
saying that Trinidad is closer to
correct.
Venezuela. Wow, look at how
Yes.
close. I mean, it's very close, actually.
Yeah, I mean, you could swim
Um,
across there.
really? Wow.
Never
Yeah.
mind probably being eaten by sharks or so on, but
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So there is that Boca del Serpiente that he
Mhm.
makes mention of, right? That little area right there, as you can see. And that's all that really is separating them by land. I'm sure at one point, in the historical context of the world, that was all one piece. They were all
Mhm.
very much connected. So again, good morning. Morning, Jonathan. We see Jonathan joining the program. We're talking this morning for the first part of the program about the rising tensions in Venezuela and that region, and exactly what does that mean for the larger region of the Caribbean, quite frankly. And so it is interesting, and I'm so happy that you kind of broke down more of the historical context. We're not here taking sides to say that Venezuela is the good guy, the U.S. is the bad guy. It's not that simple. It's a lot more complicated. And our guest this morning, Pearce Robinson, has really broken it down in terms of the complexities of what it is that we're dealing with that has been going on for many generations and many years. So Venezuela has played a particular role in the region and beyond that sometimes is extremely questionable in terms of their behavior. A lot of times, again, nothing to do with drugs, even just their aggressions. And of course, they have been admittedly aggressive towards Trinidad and Tobago. So maybe the prime minister there now feels like this is her opportunity to, if we can put it in layman's terms, to kind of flex on Venezuela a little bit, because she's got the big boy in the neighborhood, the United States of America, coming in and said, oh, yes, help us to do something about Venezuela. We want to take control. We want access to whether it's drones, or we want to put spyware on your country's land. When we saw a few weeks ago, Pearce, that the you just mentioned his name, the United States. I know we actually did an article about this in our publication, but the defense guy actually making a visit to the prime minister.
Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane.
Yes, when that happened, I thought to myself, this is interesting. I didn't see it as just he was just calling on her for absolutely no reason at all. We actually did this story on November the 24th. This was, this is something is amiss here. And sure enough, not long after that, we see that the US has now sort of partnered with Trinidad and Tobago in order to gain access to, placing certain spyware, if we can call it that, strategically on Trinidad soil. Now, there is a bit of an interesting element here where it seems like the prime minister was not entirely truthful with the people of Trinidad about what was going on. Can we discuss and clarify that just a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. Now, the thing is, I was one of the persons who, broke the story on the fact that the prime minister was not being truthful at all. In fact, you'd see that the video that I, shared on her speech showing the radar was just after she had stated that there, was no U.S. military and no U.S. hardware, when specifically asked by members of the media in the country, and that had finished when the stuff had finished. And then I published the video. That video then went viral on all Twitter and all the U.S. military sites and whatnot. And then the conversation changed from, okay, well, I didn't say it because I was doing it for national security and whatnot. I'm just paraphrasing it. That's not exact words, but that's generally what she stated. And that's understandable. But the way in which the prime minister has been going about things is giving rise to this need to inform the population.
Mhm.
Because, and I tell you this, it started quite earlier on, where, you know, the US embassy suddenly shuts down for security reasons. Then
Mhm.
people are saying, wait, all of a sudden, what's going on here, right? Then we have the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force going on state level one. They try to downplay it and then they admitted that it's true. So there's a lot of misleading going on instead of just leveling with the population and saying,
Mhm.
not necessarily taking insight, but leveling with the population and saying, listen, folks, we are in an unprecedented period in Caribbean history.
Yes.
Trinidad and Tobago sits several miles off the coast of Venezuela.
Mhm.
There are threats and potential spillovers that can affect our country. Therefore,
Mhm.
we need to take mitigating effects. Don't be alarmed, but mitigating effects to
Mhm.
ensure that you, the population, are safe and that we can treat with this in a way that doesn't impact us
Mhm.
long term, and we can ensure that the security and safety of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, so that no insurgents can come across the border or whatever, is protected. That is all you needed to say.
Yes.
And then people will be coalescing around you. But instead, what we got was talk for here, through and talk there, through and talk across the border until it's getting to a point where the next one saying, we'll bomb you, right?
Mhm.
And so, and you will see, and all these things, these are the narratives. But let me just
Mhm.
hold up a second here, because it's not just Trinidad and Tobago that Venezuela has been through and talk for. Prior
Mhm.
to all of this, we need only go back to the situation with Guyana and the Essequibo, right,
Mhm.
region. Now, Venezuela has always said, right, that that section of Guyana territory is their own, right? They even passed a law changing the maps of Venezuela officially
Mhm.
to incorporate that section of Guyana. So
Mhm.
that is the circumstances and the background to what we are seeing taking place here, right? And that, of course, would cause a lot of angst and anger in
Mhm.
not just in Guyana, with the president and so on, vociferously talking against that, but also CARICOM issued a statement, and you would recall that there was the St. Vincent and the Grenadines meeting where CARICOM brought together both Maduro and President Ali
Mhm.
to St. Vincent and the Grenadines to get them to talk, to de-escalate those tensions, to abide
Mhm.
by the ruling of the court, and then they signed the Argyle Declaration that was under the former president of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who is,
Mhm.
very honestly, quite a strong ally of the Maduro regime, right? With socialist policies and so on. So it's important to always give the context so that the viewing and listening audience is able to you know see the bigger picture of what's
Mhm.
taking place.
Mhm. So why was she not being truthful? I guess that's the question that is on a lot of her minds. Why the dishonesty?
Well, the dishonesty, in my opinion, I
Mhm.
think, is the risk of looking like all kind of people in your country, and you
Mhm.
don't know what's going on, right? And then you don't really want to admit the levels of things going on here, because you don't want to alert the Venezuelans that there are machinations taking place that are aiding and abetting, arguably, right,
Mhm.
in a posture of regime change in Venezuela. And so when you put a radar of the type that is created by Northrop, a company in the United States, who, mind you, in a New York Times article says that radar is
Mhm.
not for drug interdiction. That is for missiles and aerial defense,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But then you have the prime minister talking about, oh, that's just for the boats and drugs and interdiction. That's not true. Because we need only look at the manufacturer's website, which the New York Times did. And then when asked about the New York Times article, the prime minister then challenged the credibility of a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist from the New York Times. So
Yeah.
this is the type of, insincere politics that we're having to deal with, and which is why I harshly criticize. But in shows like this, I temper down to give people sort of a wider picture. But that picture needs to be put in the context of CARICOM's, economic contribution to Trinidad and Tobago, because it had even escalated to the extent that the prime minister would have indicated that CARICOM, by extension, is an unreliable partner, right?
Wow.
Now, I have to say that that is a preposterous statement by the prime minister, something that is not, founded in facts, because, we in Trinidad and Tobago are suffering from a serious lack of foreign exchange. It impacts everyday life, it impacts manufacturing, it impacts just the way that we conduct our affairs. It is even a struggle for Trinbagonians to go to the bank to even get $500.
Wow.
Right? So when you are saying that CARICOM is an unreliable partner, of course, the United States is the primary partner, particularly within energy stuff. That's a fact, for a very long time. But the second largest trading partner to Trinidad and Tobago, contributing over $1.1 billion into our economy, of which we have a net surplus since basically forever, right? Is CARICOM.
Wow.
And so if we are undermining that very core relationship to our economy, what it is then doing is that, we are, and by the way, we've enjoyed the largest, trading surplus with CARICOM since the whole thing, because we have the markets, we have the products, we're exporting that to the region. And so to try to undermine that, even the Minister of Finance recently, I think a few days ago, released data, which is the review of the economy for 2025, and he confirms this net positive trade balance. That in the same document released by the government, it shows that CARICOM is a reliable export market alongside the US. So the bottom line is this, that CARICOM supports our foreign exchange and our manufacturing stability. Right? Even the government's own documents released by her own finance minister indicates this. So you're talking one thing, and then you're speaking another thing. But why I think this is unhelpful and actually tarnishes Trinidad and Tobago's image is the kind of talk that we hearing even today by Senator Naked, I believe today, calling Gaston Brown a Hitler mustache guy. This is the kind of behavior that we are not accustomed to in the region. This type of posture, antagonistic posture. And it's really something that it seems very alien. It seems very influenced by external forces. And that leads me into a statement made by Mrs. Prasad Bisesa about the US visas, right? I'm sure you would have heard the comment where she is telling the people of Trinidad and Tobago, behave yourself.
Yes.
Otherwise, you'll get I'm
Not
paraphrasing
even
here.
to speak out against the US.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these are concerning state of affairs for a sovereign republic like Trinidad and Tobago, who we fought ardently against colonialism and stuff like this, to be endorsing a colonial approach of telling the citizens of your country where democracy reigns supreme, right? That you need to quiet yourself down. Don't cuss out the US because they are our partner, and be grateful, because who's going to defend us when, I'm sorry, hold up, wait a minute. Let us talk a second here.
Yes.
What happened to Ukraine? The United States promised to protect Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to Ukraine?
Right.
What happened to Afghanistan?
Mm-hmm.
They promised to protect the people of Afghanistan, but you bust out of Afghanistan so fast, right? You left all your equipment there for the Afghanis to take and use in their quote unquote terrorism, right? You was getting out of there when the proverbial it hit the fan,
Mm-hmm.
right? That thousands of people piling onto all on the wing, all on your wheel, falling off and dying, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Let's just look at the record of
Yes.
facts.
Yeah. And I mean, the record of facts also demonstrates that, as you rightfully said, the United States is only loyal to its own interests. And so
Absolutely.
I don't know what assurances she believes that she has to take such a strong position in favor of the United States government, as though she's had some guarantee written in blood that they're going to provide, I don't know what she's been promised, but money, resources, visas, whatever, to the people of Trinidad, that she can take such a very, very strong position. I found it a little bit shocking in light of, as you rightfully said, what their history has demonstrated. You have to judge someone based on their history, based on what they have brought to the table. And the U.S. has time and time again demonstrated that once their interests are involved, they will do up to a certain point, whatever is required to protect their interests and no more. It's not really about rebuilding nations and being committed to what's happening on someone else's soil. Once they're done, they're going to leave. Once they've used you, they're going to leave and leave whatever damage behind that is there. So don't forget, folks, the phone lines are open. If you'd like to join the conversation, if you have a question or comment, you're free to do so. 936-2626 is the telephone number.
I just want to make a comparison, a comparative analysis, because President Trump recently, 2 days ago, I believe, would have indicated that he wants Greenland. Right now, of course, Greenland is, belongs to the Kingdom of Denmark. So their prime minister and so on, they came out and said, absolutely not. This is our sovereign thing. And Donald Trump says he doesn't care about all that. He wants Greenland for national security. Of course, Greenland has a lot of critical minerals, rare earths, and a lot of oil, right? But he says he needs it for national security because they're Russian boats circling all over it. Their prime minister said that is not true. There are no Russian boats thing. But I want people to understand this. This is a sovereign country territory.
Yes.
And he also said to Canada that he wants to make Canada a state. And the Canadians had to say, well, hello, no, we can't do that because we're our own country. But guess what? It now appears with the radar in Tobago, if we listen to the narrative of the President of the United States, that have we now fallen under that ambit? And is that why we are now being told, hush your mouth, don't speak about the US because you visas, this, that, and the other? You understand what I'm saying? And then it widens the conversation to understand the issues at play.
Yes. We've got a caller in the line. Good morning, caller. Welcome to the program.
Miss Sandra, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I was just calling you a video that I see on Mall Road.
Okay.
Where a lady went to purchase some items.
Okay.
However, she was given a bag by the cashier. If you watch the video, where she thought the cashier gave her a present. When she came home in the evening, she showed the present to me and said she went and buys this item and she got this as a present. I said to her, but mommy, this now no use to me and you. It is a drone, a toy drone. So I said to her, what are you going to do with this? And he said, the only thing you can do with this is to give it to Jordan, because only Jordan know how to operate them, something and me even know. But if you watch the video, from the beginning coming in, you can see where the cashier
Yes. There was definitely
to
some mix up with it. So listen, we're in a totally different conversation at the moment with our guests. We do have some guests in the studio. So if you don't mind just WhatsApping me the details of how to find her, that would be appreciative. Because I think the owner of that present, the reason why that video was shared, is the owner of that present is simply looking to, speak to her to get it back, to get the package back.
Yes, she can get by the present, but the person is not here now. The person is gone to Jamaica.
Oh, good
so
Lord.
She can get back the present.
All right. Let me just WhatsApp me if you don't mind the details, and then we'll try to connect you with the other lady and see what can be worked out.
Okay, ma'am.
All right, my dear. Thank you so much. Okay, dear. As you can see, Pearce, we solve all sorts of problems here. Reuniting people with packages, including. So I was trying to actually download some of your videos here because, again, they are, I think, really, really indicative of, wow. I mean, you've got some exclusive videos where we see people, for example, actually, we see the footage of the U.S. military presence becoming more and more prominent on Trinidad and Tobago soil. We see vessels coming in, we see ships coming in, and it's just like, wow, this is really, really something else. There's one here that I was even having a look at where the U.S. government took one of the tankers. Now they've confiscated several tankers, which they claim were part of, these oil sanctions that they have going on. It's the actions thus far of this government. And I must say, outside of President Trump and what he says about taking other people's land, which is preposterous, wanting to take Canada, Iceland, as you say, all these other areas, it is really, really shocking that he has been permitted by his own government to take these actions and no one has said, what on earth are you doing? How is this permissible? How is this allowed? And so anyone who is paying attention to world affairs, regional affairs, have to recognize that I am not of the opinion that President Trump is entirely, mentally stable. But beyond that, I also see that his own party, his own leaders in his country are willing to sit back and allow him to do almost anything. Carte blanche. And so that is what makes me the most concerned, is no one appears to be willing to stop him. So never in a million years in my short life did I ever think that I would be saying, wow, Russia is going to step in and do something good for Russia, good for China versus the United States of America. I lived in the States for 15 years, so it is shocking that now who we thought, and I guess it's very situational, who we thought was the good guy versus the bad guy, there isn't. You have to look at the facts of what is happening in every single situation. So here's one of the videos that you posted on your social media channel, and this demonstrates the Americans taking one of the oil tankers. What are they doing with the oil tanker when they take it?
President Trump said that they're going to take the oil. They might sell it, or they just might add it to their arsenal, but they'll take the oil under U.S. control, and they'll take the ships as well.
Wow.
Yeah. But just, I do note that there are a few Republicans who have been speaking out against President Trump, the most vocal of them being a Republican senator, I think. Rand Paul from Kentucky. Right. He's been very vocal about condemning the maritime strikes and, of course, the extrajudicial killings, the first of which happened just off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. And that is the one that is currently being investigated by the United States government, its architecture in Congress, about the legality of it. Because mere days after that, we had a body washing up ashore in Trinidad and Tobago. Burnt and blown up body washing up ashore. We have Senator Lisa Murkowski. She's from Kansas. She's been speaking out as well. and a few others.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, it's not nearly enough.
Yes.
And I think that is at the crux of it, because that's probably
Mm-hmm.
about 4 or 5 that you could count on your hand out of how many, you know? And so there is a sense of, there is a sense of him feeling like he can do what he can, because there's no pushback. And in fact, they voted recently to try, I think a Democrat and Republican brought a motion to try to curtail the president's war powers in terms of drugs and so on. And, you know, he was able to beat that motion. So there is quite clearly an effort within the political, spectrum of the United States that supports these activities to gain control of Venezuela's, oil and so on. Who President Trump says the land, the oil, and so on of Venezuela is his, because Chevron and ExxonMobil and stuff were kicked out of Venezuela by Hugo Chavez in the 2000s. And so he wants it back because it's theirs, and it's their oil, it's their land, and then we're getting into some sort of area that is very, very alien, you know what I mean?
Interesting. All right, we've got some comments here that we'll get to from our listeners and some questions. Kina Maro says this is all old topics, move on. How would you respond to people who think that?
I mean, I wouldn't respond, and I'll tell you why. It just gives rise to people kind of taking these things for granted, right? Because the minute any war begins in the Caribbean, you will see how old that topic is, right? It will have an immediate impact on your standard of life. And so when we're talking about things in that are happening in the Cayman Islands and all this type of stuff, what would happen? These are real risks, right? Because I want to point you to some stats that I gave in my article about Tobago, right? How you almost had, I think 70-something% bookings that went down to 40-something because of the war stuff. You know what I mean? So because of this war machination and talk and anxiety and stuff, people are already canceling their reservations in the region. They want to be no part of it. And for many countries who rely on tourism, like the Turks and Caicos, Cayman Islands and so on, right? That is your primary source of income. There are those of us who don't necessarily rely on tourism. And so we might fare a little better, but we still won't fare well, right? But if you are relying as your base is tourism, you ought to be concerned. This is not old news. This is present as long as we have vessels in our waters. The most amount of vessels that there has ever been in the region, especially in over 30 years. We bring in vessels from the Middle East here. So you understand that this is a threat theater, the likes of which we've never seen, some of us in our lifetime. You understand? So this is not old news. This is the present. This is our reality.
Yes.
And if escalation is to occur, we need all of us across the region, irrespective of who, what, where, how, what party, need to be prepared. We need to be telling our citizens how to prepare, and we need to take this seriously.
Yes. And to demonstrate further to the listener who claims that this is old news, all you have to do is do a quick search of the news, and BBC News covered it yesterday, talking about Trump. The headline says Trump says he will keep or sell oil seized from Venezuela. CNN 3 hours ago did an analysis on how China has condemned Trump's Venezuela blockade. Al Jazeera a day ago, Trump warns Maduro not to play tough as Russia and China back Venezuela. Even Vanity Fair, is in the conversation. The real reason Trump keeps ranting about Venezuelan oil. We've got the Times, we've got Sky News, we've got the New York Times 15 hours ago. These are all live, topical, and very important international and regional conversations that are happening all over the world. If you think that this is old news, you live in a bubble that is very you're disillusioned. Like you're just, for whatever reason, you're not willing to accept the facts for what they are. But that's your choice. We all have choices in life about how we're going to view world events and regional events. And so, it is what it is. According to Chris King here, Trump didn't say any of that. Obviously there is video footage of him saying the things that he say. People don't just pull this out of thin air. There's more than.
And I posted the video on my page with him speaking that. So it's
yeah.
Perhaps people like to say Trump derangement syndrome and so on, but then I think Trump suffers from his own derangement syndrome because he says things that he has. He says that he hasn't said things when we see it on video as well. So look, we're not going to get into the semantics of those things.
Yeah,
we're going to focus on the facts, right? And the facts are that as a region, just to re-emphasize, we are looking at a one risk space. No matter what we say, how we want to interpret it, we are looked at as a one risk space. And if any war begins, you're going to see NOTAMs spread across the entire region, which is when they close off your airspace, because we're going to have flights and jets and stuff moving up and down the space. Nobody is flying to the region in that scenario because the risk of some missile going somewhere and hurting somebody is very, very real. And I'm going to say this as well. This is something that I speak very plainly to my colleagues in the United States and security committees, right? That the risk of fragmented insurgency in the region is very real. And why I say that? Now, US intelligence indicates that, of course, Iran is funding, and FARC and so they're funding, militias in Venezuela and stuff like that. So think about how people fight wars. Yes, how do people fight wars? Well, they have proxies, right? Proxies are groups and insurgents and mercenaries that are spread across all sorts of different places to destabilize places and positions. Why? Well, then you spread people thin because, all of a sudden you have some terrorist attack that happens in the Cayman Islands or something unsettling that unravels the government of Jamaica. These are all hypotheticals. Then you realize, wait, something's happening there. We didn't realize that, because look at this. In the middle of this whole military marine buildup, right? We had 2 people who were kidnapped from Trinidad and Tobago and are going to be taken to Venezuela with a huge ransom. How did that happen? When we have a radar, we have just minutes away from the Defense Force base there in Stoke. How did that happen? And this is to show you, because of our proximity to the violence and so on, we in the region are in danger. So we cannot just shrug these things to the side because I'm in the Turks and Caicos or I'm in Bermuda and I feel this, that, and the other. We need to get off of this high horse, right? It has no high horse in war, It has regional implication.
Yes. Question from Robin. She says, why did the U.S. give Trinidad $4.7 million? The U.S. needs to stop buying friends. The money stops, the friendship ends. I think that's probably a rhetorical question, but
I can't speak to that. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Allard says, how has Trinidad's financial position changed with respect to their extreme shortage of US dollars, particularly since 4 months ago in August 2025, when the Trinidad Republic Financial Holdings successfully completed its ownership of Cayman National Bank and subsequently delisted Cayman National from the Cayman Islands Stock Exchange as part of its strategy to gain control of a regional financial institution. Now, this poses, Allard, actually a very, very good question, and why we have to recognize the interconnectivity of the entire region. Someone else mentioned our food supply primarily coming from the United States of America, and how that could potentially be impacted if this situation gets any worse. But Ellard makes a fantastic point, Pearce, that, Trinidad and Tobago institutions have had their hands for a number of years in Cayman's financial institutions as well. And so whatever happens in Trinidad could very likely impact the banks here and the institutions here that they have ownership in. So I think that that's a very fair and quite a solid point that he's making in terms of the financial interconnectivity as well. So Gabby says, give the oil to Trump, go into the oil business with the man. Caymanians ain't built for war. So this is a very, it's an interesting perspective that if the bully comes in the playground and we give the bully everything that they want, that's going to somehow stop the bully. Like the bully will ever be satisfied. Let's talk about this concept of just giving in and just giving people what they want. And then that will keep us all safe.
I will ask, in answer to this question, I will ask a question. Did Dr. Eric Williams give in? Or did he fight for our sovereignty? Did he fight for our Republican status? Did he fight for our independence? Right? And this may not necessarily be relevant to folks who are still under a different jurisdiction. But I am just saying that in terms of Trinidad and Tobago, sovereignty and even self-determination for islands like Cayman Islands and so on is important. You don't just give in. You don't just hand things over just because a big man says so. Because if that's the case, then any criminal that walks into your front door, just give it because you want to stay out of trouble. And I know that, on your program and your show and stuff, you do a lot of human service in terms of catching people, in terms of making sure that there is good being done in the community. So you know more than I do, right? And equally, how important it is not to give in, not to allow criminals to take over society and stand up for what is right.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, not just the obvious criminals, the politicians, all sorts of people. We have to be prepared to stand up for what is right.
That's right.
Tali says, what can Trinidad, Tobago do to withdraw the support given to the U.S.?
That is a very difficult situation, and I'll tell you why. Because we're now in a situation where we've already extended ourselves quite extensively, to the extent even recently of, allowing U.S. military craft to use our space for logistic purposes, right? You can't just walk that back now, because these are agreements that have been signed. These are things that have been done. So we're in it, right? And hopefully we're in it to win it as opposed to lose it, right? We can only hope that. But given the prevailing circumstances surrounding us, we are now in a position where we have to be very guarded with the language that we're using to not further exacerbate the tensions that are taking place between our countries, to avoid getting into a tit for tat with Venezuelan extremists, right? And to say, listen, I will not respond to that. The Prime Minister's done that a few times. Listen, I'm not going to give any attention to that. We need more of that, right? Because we're in a situation where, and actually, I want to talk about, in the article I wrote about, what wholeness can do and so on, right? But I want to draw people's attention to something. And there is something that I quite like about Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar, right? When she is focused on something that she cares about, she's very forceful about it, right? Very forthright about her position and strong in it. And this occurred to me that when she was the CARICOM Chair in 2013, you would recall that we had a situation with the Dominican Republic and its treatment of Haitians and so on, right? You would recall that, right? Now, Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar very, very strongly had a no-nonsense approach about that when she was the CARICOM chair. And in fact, she was so strong about that it led to the suspension of the Dominican Republic's membership application, right? Which of course was the trigger point where a court ruled that the citizenship, that the DR stripping the citizenship of 200 people was basically unlawful, right? And Mrs. Passar-Bissessar invoked under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which she cited herself, which gives her the powers so to do, and regional values, and her obligations under the CARICOM Charter that gives her the power to bring people into line. And in fact, Mrs. Passar-Bissessar didn't just stop there. She didn't just deal with that comprehensively. She then elevated the situation to the Association of Caribbean States and CELAC, right? To show how serious she was about ensuring that CARICOM enforces discipline, remains united in its position, and that there were consequences for delineating from the shared principles and values that CARICOM shares. So it's very interesting that as CARICOM chair in 2013, Mrs. Passar-Bissessar was very strong in her leadership, but is now seemingly, at least from Andrew Holness, stewardship over the CARICOM body, taking away attention from the fact that she invoked the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to deal with folks who are being belligerent, as Trinidad and Tobago now is, in terms of how we're dealing with things. So Andrew Holness now can take the advice of Mrs. Passar-Bissessar's 2013 premiership and chairmanship of the bloc and say, well, look, I'm not going to sit idly by. I'm going to recognize the concerns that Mrs. Passar-Bissessar has validly brought to the attention of CARICOM, and whether we have or have not, because we had yesterday the Foreign and CARICOM Minister in Trinidad and Tobago indicating, of course, that CARICOM defended Guyana, but has been silent on Trinidad and Tobago, right? So, Holness can't be silent, because silence is his decision. And he can either sit there and allow himself to get caught up. And I want to bring this point, right? Because it was Holness in Trump's first term that was accused of acting in the same way that Mrs. Passar-Bissessar was when he joined a group of Caribbean leaders to Mar-a-Lago, when the Caribbean was, including Trinidad and Tobago, was pushing the zone of peace, right, mechanism, right, which was agreed in 2019 by CARICOM, Mexico, and Uruguay. They, involved the UN and other EU bodies, right, and it was it's all about lowering the tension, right, not picking sides, focusing on dialogue, negotiation, non-intervention, That is the position that we in the region have held as small states. That has given us that political cover to stay neutral, to look after our bottom line, and ensure that we protect our tourism, we protect our trade, we protect aviation, we protect the ordinary people, right? Because it is buying us time, right? It reduces the pressure on all of our economies, and it prevents an escalation, of course, by design. So that mechanism exists primarily so the Caribbean isn't dragged into to big power conflicts. That basically the declaration was. The Chaguaramas thing was built to prevent, right? We don't want that in our region. And so in 2019, we, as a bloc, successfully stymied the attempt of President Trump in his first term to do this exact thing, despite, having people like Holness and a few Caribbean leaders who went down to Mar-a-Lago were embarrassingly left standing, waiting for President Trump, and then promised all sorts of investments and for being part and parcel of this, which never came. So I want people to understand that sometimes people tell you all kind of lofty things so that you can do them what they want, but when it's their time to return the favor, you get nothing.
All right, we've got a caller in the line. Good morning, caller. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Sandy.
Morning, dear.
Listening to this gentleman and the recent activities, a lot of us need to remember what the United States did to Grenada, what they did to Jamaica. All the documents, most of the documents has been declassified, so people can go and see what the United States government did to Jamaica because we did not bow to their demands. And when you are going to be telling, when a country is going to look at another sovereign state and say they are going to be taking over, this is going back into history, and it is going right back to the Native Americans. That's what they did. And the United States as a superpower, they flex their muscles and they do things like this. And they don't care. Whatever they can suck from you like a leech, they will do that. And when they are finished, they will leave you on your face. Ukraine was promised the United States help. What is happening now? You're on your own.
Well, not only on their own, but in fact, you could argue, caller, that the current administration has taken a very favorable position towards Russia in the Ukraine-Russia war, which is heading into 4 years now. They've defunded Ukraine. They have publicly said things favorable to Russia's position and basically told Ukraine to just give up, just give Russia what they want.
It's not surprising to me. It's not surprising to me that America will throw those who call them friends and allies under the bus. So what this lady is doing in Trinidad, she is digging herself in a hole that Trinidad won't be able to get out of. And I think the Caribbean region know what they have to do. You understand? I remember she made a statement about Jamaica after I think it was a passage of Beryl. And that statement that she made, she had to go to Jamaica and apologize. Because where you hit people is in their pocket. And I can tell you, as a Jamaican, I do not buy Trinidad product anymore. I don't. And as I rightly heard the gentleman say that CARICOM is one of Trinidad's biggest supporter in taking their goods. So, I mean, we carry other CARICOM countries. We know how to deal with certain things. It's just sad that as a Caribbean country, you are aiding and abiding and abetting a bully to do what they feel like they want to do.
Thank you, caller. I appreciate it. 936-2626 is the telephone number. We have a number of questions and comments coming through on the live feed. I'm going to go through and read some of those as well this morning. Wow.
But I just want to quickly just touch on something that the caller said. So because of how the United States is operating in the region, you know, the region and its population, people are generally becoming very, very anti-American in terms of their posture, right? And I think this, as I've been warning folks in the United States, this is the real risk, that while you're correcting the problem, you're creating a bigger issue for the United States in the long term, right? Now, we need to take a pause for a second, because the United States has also contributed significantly to the region in terms of investing in infrastructure, investing in security and so on. So it's not to say that, historically they just, hey, and they're doing what they want and stuff like that. That's not that we need to look at things a little bit more on a balanced scale. And so, when the Prime Minister says, look at, who has been helping us and stuff, there's an aspect of that rings true, because, the United States has done quite a lot to benefit Trinidad and Tobago's economy, to fortify our relationships, to bring us to a particular, disposition that allows us to actively engage in ways that are important. So we can't undermine or discount that strategic relationship. It's abundantly important. But at the same time, this must never turn into a situation that I'll give you money, so you have to give me a land, right? I give you money, because we're not negotiating that. Bilateral engagement and diplomacy always has to be at a level-headed thing where people's sovereignty is not up for sale, because the United States is not going to give up its sovereignty to anyone, and nor must we. And so that is where we have got to focus the conversation and be guarded against Blanchard, anti-American sentiment, which of course should be geared towards the politicians per se, who in the United States, a lot of people don't agree with. 70% of Americans, according to a poll, says that they don't agree with this. And the majority of the population in Trinidad and Tobago do not agree with what their prime minister is doing. And so when, of course, we take all these rash decisions, we're not buying Trinidad products, we're not doing this, we're not doing that, while yes, that is the immediate impact. The long-term effects of doing that also is just affecting the ordinary person who, like you, doesn't agree with what their government is doing. But then you get rid of that market, and then you have to find another market. And perhaps that other market is more expensive than Trinidad's market. So your prices for the things that you take for granted is going up, and your cost of living is going up. And so this is the situation that the Caribbean now finds itself in. How do we manage this clear, strategic, difficult dichotomy to ensure that we're taking the decisions that are helpful to the bottom line of our respective islands?
Listen, I mean, we can sit down and pretend like this has nothing to do with us, but it has everything to do with us. I mean, when we talk about the rise in cost alone of life, somebody just mentioned, thank you so much to this listener to the program, Risa, says many external insurance companies licensed in the Cayman Islands actually have UBOs in Trinidad, not just banks. So you talk about the cost of insurance going up again. Absolutely. Pay attention, folks. You got to pay attention. Jonathan says sovereignty and diplomacy is important. George Fullerton said that Trinidad also bought some companies in Jamaica, such as the Jamaica Cement Company is now Trinidad Cement Company, just one example of this regional expansion. So very, very interesting.
Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago business persons are well known to be very aggressive in terms of acquisitions in the region. And so, when people in the region don't really look at, I went to St. Kitts and Nevis once, and somebody was telling me about their Carib little factory they have in St. Vincent. And they said, this is our thing. And I thought, wow, Carib has managed to implant itself so well in St. Kitts and Nevis that people think it's a local grown thing, but that's actually from Trinidad. And so when people don't realize how entrenched our companies have in terms of their aggressive acquisitions of things regionally from banks, from, little, drinks places and whatnot, that they're just buying up everything. We are a lot more integrated than you think. And anything that happens in Trinidad and Tobago is going to have a regional spillover. And this is a real life regional spillover that will have an effect on your standard of living.
Wow. All right, folks, just a quick breaking announcement this morning as we continue to have this conversation. Right now, over 2,200 CUC customers in the District of West Bay are without power. And I can tell you that that is because there is a tree, a very large and sizable tree, actually, that has fallen in the roadway and into somebody's yard. So let me show you guys some footage this morning. Pearce, just give me 1 second. We just want to advise our listeners of this developing story. So there's the tree. It looks like one of those, almost like the ones that looks like a Christmas tree, but it is extremely large. It has fallen down. And thank you so much to our residents there in the beautiful District of West Bay who sent through some footage. But yes, this has now impacted over 2,200 customers who are now without power. So we see it's actually taken out a power line, and there it is right across the road on Watercoast Road. So folks, the police are in the area. We ask for you to please give them the respective opportunity to, fix whatever they have to fix. CUC, no doubt, will be in the area shortly to try to get those power lines back up and working. But first, they've got to remove the tree. So you see it went straight across the road into somebody else's yard, and see all those power lines right there, all down. So the current outage map is showing that over 2,200 people are without power. All right, so let's go back to our guest, Mr. Pearce Robinson. And we do have a caller in the line. Good morning, caller. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Sandra, and good morning to your special guest there.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning. I just joined you about maybe 20 minutes ago. I imagine I understand enough of the topic to be able to chime in very briefly. Anytime a leader does what Mrs. Bissessa is doing, I think in Trinidad they just tend to say KAMLA. What KAMLA is doing is hypocritical, and I think it is good that that is pointed out. And that should be the case with every leader who becomes hypocritical. If they go out and they tout themselves as having certain principles, when they resile from those principles, we must go back and say, you can't do this. Why? Because it's wrong. And secondly, because it's contradictory. That's one. Mm-hmm. But secondly, the other thing that has to be realized regarding this matter is at the end of the day, smaller countries such as those in the Caribbean need to be able to work together so that they can improve their bargaining position, and so that they cannot easily be divided up by offer of money, visas, or whatever it is. So to me, really, having worked also in a regional economic grouping, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, I did get into these issues a little bit. At the end of the day, the Caribbean has to work together and heighten its level of economic and political integration the way the EU has done. The people in Africa have to do the same, the BRICS have to do the same, and improve their bargaining position, because without a common bargaining position of the smaller countries, they will always find themselves in these positions where they are being divided up. So we have, in conclusion, let me just say, that's where we have to go back to what was touted by Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, saying, for example, the Caribbean must unite, Africa must unite, Asia must unite, the BRICS must unite, not to fight the rest of the world, but to improve their bargaining position. I thought that I should throw that in, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. So under this idea of unity, we were just talking about, for example, what Jamaica's position is going to be, what Mr. Holness has said. What do you think of unification, generally speaking, in the region? CARICOM, it looks now like Trinidad is going to cut ties with CARICOM. What are some of the broader implications around this concept of unifying the region, of trying to take a singular position on this issue, if that's possible?
Look, I've always been a strong proponent of regional integration to the extent of, political and economic, right? I feel that our leaders are quite weak, with the exception of one or two, are quite weak in terms of actually taking the necessary decisions that would bring us to a point of being a formidable space. When we came up with the West Indies Federation, of course, coming out of an understanding, promoted, of course, a lot by Trinidad and Tobago's politicians back then. It was against the backdrop of understanding all the things we understand today. Yeah? It's because it's not like any of these issues are new. This has been an ongoing thing. And these are issues that came long before the establishment of the European Union. And in fact, the West Indies Federation is what the the EU used as their benchmark thing to build the EU institution as to what it is today. They bore that out from the West Indies Federation. But our problem in the region is we're too fragmented. Everyone wants to pump their chest. And this is a post-colonial thing with people in our societies, because we all feel that we need to pump our chests and stuff and not recognize what that caller has just said, that power resides in the community. And there's a historical saying that dates back to our ancestors, that it takes a village to raise a child. And how many children are we raising outside of the village when we are existing in this one place that everyone else in the world looks at one region to such an extent that every single island is Jamaica to them, right?
Yes.
So if we are all looked as one, what is this resistance to acting as one, right? Because, I said to the New York Times that, of course, with this escalation and stuff, that it's quite clear that forget all the fluff that they're talking about. This is about oil, and this is about regime change. This is what it boils down to. Because I have a clip of President Trump saying exactly that. That, Venezuela has so much oil and he wants to take it, and that needs to be under US control. The guy says what he thinks and then tries to dance around it a bit later when people pay down on him on those things. But he said it plainly. So if anyone wants to come now and say, oh, actually, it's because of narcotics, oh, actually, it's because of narco this and narco that, it's not. Because if it was about narco terrorism, then you wouldn't be releasing one of the biggest narco terrorists in the entire Western Hemisphere and releasing him because he wrote, oh, President Trump, you're so great and I like you. That is the type of thing. So this narco conversation is fake, okay? This is about regime change. And let me pay down into regime change. And
can I just play that clip for the benefit of,
absolutely.
Because, again, we've got people here who say, you guys are making this up. You just don't like Trump. He never said that. So let's see precisely what he said.
In about a year from now, we'll have so much critical mineral and rare earths that you won't know what to do with
exactly, but we are certainly looking at land now because we've got the sea very well under control. And the way you look at it is every boat that we knock out, we save 25,000 American lives. But I think Venezuela is feeling heat, but I think a lot of other countries are feeling heat too.
US President Donald Trump has insisted the US should not buy oil from Venezuela, even suggesting taking it by force.
We're buying oil from Venezuela. When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door. But now we're buying oil from Venezuela, so we're making a dictator very rich. Can you believe this? Nobody can believe it.
The US has been accused of seizing oil from countries where it conducts military operations. The former Iraqi president said that $150 billion of oil money had been stolen from the Middle Eastern country since the US invaded 2 decades ago. Syrian officials claimed last August that up to 80% of the country's oil production was being plundered on a daily basis. Trump has openly said on a number of occasions the US has been taking oil from Syria.
We are leaving soldiers to secure the oil. Now, we may have to fight for the oil. That's okay. But we're keeping the oil. Remember that. I've always said that. Keep the oil. We want to keep the oil. $45 million a month. Keep the oil. We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil. We did leave soldiers because we're keeping the oil. And we've secured the oil. Other than that, there's no reason for it, in our opinion. And we've secured the oil, and therefore a small number of U.S. troops will remain in the area where they have the oil.
Well, I don't know how many more times he needed to say it. But those are various clips from over several years where Trump has made it very, very clear that, as he says in his own words, he's keeping the oil.
Yeah, and he said it just yesterday too when speaking to reporters that they're going to keep the oil, they will sell it, they will just put it as part of their reserves. But yeah, I wanted to talk about this because remember I spoke about Hugo Chavez, and this is the policy of the US neoliberalism and imperialism that he spoke about, of how they feel that they could just take people's stuff and whatever. That's the Venezuela socialist type of approach to thing, which is a U.S. posture that is being resisted, of course, by the Venezuelans. Okay, and this is, when we talk about hard facts and stuff like that, hard talk, whatever, real facts, whatever. This is the things that people often want to pretend don't exist. Okay, but in terms of regime change, I want us to pare that down for a little bit because it is essential for us to understand that Venezuela constitutes the largest deposits of oil, even more than Saudi Arabia, and we all thought Saudi Arabia, right? Even more than Saudi, the largest deposits of oil anywhere on planet Earth, okay?
Wow.
So anybody who controls that, like Trump says, want to keep the oil, that Venezuela's oil is theirs and so on and so forth, right? That is a fight of the century.
I must admit that I did not know that.
Oh,
I
wow.
did not know that. Yes.
Well,
I mean, I knew
Venezuela,
they were a big player, but I didn't know they were.
Yes, Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of oil on the planet. Okay, and so this changes the attention of what we're talking about, right? And so when we speak about regime change, there is a real reason for regime change. Because if you want to keep the oil, you want to take control of the oil, and your foreign policy is about oil. You can't have the person who is, anti-establishment, anti-imperial, and pushing a socialist platform, who believes in kind of just socializing the whole thing, right? You want to make sure that you have control of that. So you got to get those people out. So you want to pursue regime change, right? And of course, regime change carries a direct spillover for the region for the same reasons we spoke about before, right? Because small states like ours will absorb the fallout, even though we had nothing to do with the machinations of it, right? We're next door, we're in the region, and that's that. So I don't know if you know, but the EU foreign policy chief, her name is Kallas. She's the Estonian prime minister. She's specifically warned against regime change efforts, stating that, of course, they often create instability rather than order, right? And this prolonged sort of pressure campaign, the political risk raises to an extent that then starts to have spillover effects, right? And people, neighboring regions suffer the economic and security blowback, right? When things go out of turn. And then we have to consider, from a Trinidad and Tobago perspective, what happens if regime change fails? What happens if Donald Trump, maybe does an attack, but then it fails and they said, you know what, let's not risk the US lives. Maybe they attack a few strategic locations, but then Maduro is even killed. But another strong man is elected and they don't get to install it. What happens then for Trinidad and Tobago? Have we considered that? Just 7 miles off the coast, up against a state that the United States intelligence forces indicates as being propped up by the Iranians through proxies, through FARC, and through Hezbollah, right? What then happens to the prevailing situation, our security situation, when it's so easy for criminals to go across the border and kidnap 2 of our nationals? What happens?
Wow. This is such an important point, because as you were talking about this, I was putting my mind to thinking, when has regime change that has been sort of led by the U.S. and sometimes the United States of America have gone into countries and supported coups? They have assassinated foreign leaders. They've done all sorts of stuff historically. And I'm trying to think of when it has ever actually been successful. So I have a couple examples here of where there have been failures, right? So Albania, late 1940s to 1950s, the CIA trained and infiltrated anti-communist Albanian dissidents to spark an uprising against the leader there, the regime there. And that did not work out for them well. Syria, 1956 to 1957. Iraq, even with Saddam Hussein in the 1990s, those countries are no better off than they were in many instances before. It's difficult to see where a lot of this has been beneficial to anyone. Even in terms of even the U.S. and their own interests have oftentimes been compromised. Libya, 2011, Iraq again, and with the 2003 invasion, Iran, 1953. There is a pattern, of course, of the U.S. getting involved in these types of efforts, covert operations during the Cold War, and even, beyond. And there has been a real question mark over how successful that has been.
Yeah,
all right. Yes.
I was just going to say, for us in international relations, perhaps you're looking at the whole question wrong, because some of the places that you would have indicated that many of us in the region who are looking at what has resulted would say, this is a failure. But in terms of the US foreign policy, it's not a failure. And I'll tell you why, right? For example, in Panama in 1989, they were successful in getting rid of the regime, the dictator Manuel Noriega, right, in 1989. And that led to relative stability in their view. And then, of course, a leadership that was aligned with the United States. Grenada, 1983, which your caller, invoked, despite what people say, the United States foreign policy looks at that as a successful, turnover, because it prevented a sort of Marxist military council, and then restored the Governor General's authority, which then led to the democratic elections in 1984. Even though critics say what they have to say, the US foreign policy looks at that as a success because you got rid of sort of the Russian influence from the Western Hemisphere that was trying to, arsenalize itself and militarize itself in the United States back door. So regardless of what happens after to the people and whatever, they don't care. That's not a part. As far as they're concerned, they got rid of the problem. And then, of course, people often don't remember this, but the Dominican Republic in 1961 to 1965, right? You also had the US being very instrumental in undermining and getting rid of the Trujillo dictatorship that they had back then, right? They later intervened, put a set of soldiers down there, a set of troops in 1965. And then after it was all in an effort to prevent a second Cuba from starting up in the region. So anytime there are, situations whereby countries are getting a little bit turning too much to the left, and that unsettles the United States in its own back door. They then start to try to push out the foreign influences. And then for them, that is a success because it's an ideological war, right, of neoliberalism, capitalism, the liberal international architecture. And anything that undermines that is an illiberal concept. They tend to want to diminish and use force to ensure that regime change is instituted and democracy is brought back. These are the terms that are often used. And today, those terms are narco trade, narco terrorism, and stuff, when in reality, it's all about ensuring that you have people who are aligned. And I think if you look back to Trump's statements, just really quickly, he spoke about, ensuring, and Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth and all these people, they speak about ensuring that, the U.S. new posture of peace through strength. You'd rather be a friend than an enemy, right? And this is the stance of the United States at this point, which is a historical stance of the U.S. and how it aligns itself with its foreign policy priorities.
Wow. Very, very interesting indeed. Folks, we're getting quite an education here today. Hope you guys are paying attention. I do have an email that we were privy to yesterday that was sent from the deputy premier, who is, my apologies, the deputy leader of the opposition, Mr. Kenneth Bryan, and he shared some concerns with both the premier of the Cayman Islands and the governor. So let's just have a quick read of that. And I saw someone again commenting, what does this have to do with us? Why don't you guys mind your own business? You're not American citizens. This goes far beyond what is happening on American soil, and I think we all need to pay attention. So MP Kenneth Bryan said, "Dear Governor Owen and Premier Ebanks, I'm writing you today in my capacity as a member of Parliament to convey the serious concerns of my constituents regarding the escalating global and regional tensions within the Caribbean. The current military posture of the Trump administration, including naval blockades and active operations in nearby waters, has created significant public anxiety. I wish to formally inquire if the government is monitoring these developments as a potential threat to our national interests. Specifically, I'm requesting information on trade route protection, what strategic measures are in place to ensure our essential trade routes remain open and secure from external military interference. Number 2, safety of mariners. What specific protocols have been established to protect Caymanian fishermen and boaters operating in international regional waters during this period of heightened naval activity? And furthermore, if the government assesses that these regional tensions pose no immediate risk to the Cayman Islands, I strongly urge you to issue a formal public statement to that effect. Many residents have expressed deep concern, and a clear message of assurance from your offices would come a long way in maintaining public calm and confidence. I look forward to your timely response on these matters of national security." And of course, Mr. Bryan didn't mention the intertwining of our financial services. Again, we talked about banks and insurance companies having a direct connection to Trinidad and Tobago, for example. Oil, the one thing we always complain about here is the price of gas and the price of our utility bill, because that's directly tied into the price of oil. And this will destabilize not just the region. If what you say about Venezuela, being such a critical player in the provision of oil, this is going to, have a direct impact on our money, on what it's costing us at the pump. So again, these are the reasons why we're having this conversation today. I appreciate that it is Christmas Eve and we could be sitting here talking about what's underneath the Christmas tree, but this is a critical conversation to have, because we don't know what tomorrow brings in relation to this ongoing escalation and how quickly things can change. 25% of the United States fleet, naval fleet, is now in the region. 25%. That's nothing to sneeze at. That is someone who has a clear intent of engaging on a military level. You don't move all of those ships there for no reason at all. What I will also tell you, by way of what is happening regionally, we also know that the Russians have now moved some ships in the area. And funny enough, there was an article, I can't remember where I saw it, but basically demonstrating how, it might have been on your page, Pearce, how the Russians don't give a cahoots about anything, right? They literally took their ships and passed right through the so-called American blockade and said, "What are you going to do about it?" So it's not a pretty picture in terms of what could actually happen here. But you have, everyone's like, well, Venezuela could never win a war against the United States of America on their own. That is very likely true. But when they've got China and Russia coming to the rescue and Cuba, that changes the dynamics of what could actually happen. So it's concerning.
I mean, look, go ahead,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I mean, look, let's look at something first. So let's look at that question. Venezuela can never win a war against the United States. There's an aspect of truth to that, but I'll caveat it a bit as well. In terms of the military force and might, absolutely not. Right? The equipment is dated, things are aged, and in terms of air force and firepower in that respect, the United States will completely consume Venezuela. That's just a fact. However, that's not necessarily how warfare is conducted, right? If indeed you want to pursue regime change, you need boots on the ground to take control of those strategic assets. And now that is not going to happen, in my respectful view. Now, it is possible that United States will successfully launch an air campaign and so on and raid and bomb certain strategic bases and stuff like that. Absolutely. But President Maduro has instituted something called the All People's War Doctrine, which he's essentially going into communities and handing out weapons, which have been, arguably sponsored by the Iranians, right? Lots and lots of weapons being distributed in the communities. I think I posted on it on my page a video, right? And this kind of situation, it presents a very uncertain position for the United States. For example, if they were to go on land, Venezuela will be the next Vietnam. They were going to lose it, right? They just don't have enough personnel to be able to successfully, invade the island, right? Venezuela has 500,000 active military personnel, and there are 15,000 active military persons in the Caribbean at this time, right? That's a complete blowout. But not just that, you also have to include the militia forces, which Maduro says is up to 8 million people, right? Trained by FARC, trained by Hezbollah, trained by Iran, right? And then you also have the discussion about how the Russian, I can't remember the name now, the Russian mercenaries are also training folks in Venezuela. So you have lots of people who understand their own terrain, right? Who understand the stuff. So while you got to know where things are kept. But the problem with President Maduro distributing now weapons and stuff to the civilian population at large, you don't know who's who and you don't know what's where. So while you might blow up a weapons factory or whatever you think it is, you also have weapons in the hands of civilians as well, who are acting as part of that militia. The police have been formed into this whole ambit as well. And so you have a complete situation where the entire Venezuelan state, supported by its proxies in Cuba, in Iran, with Hezbollah and FARC, are all contributing to that. And then you have the difficulty of sharing borders with countries that also have drug-related issues and whatever, who can send resources across the border, who you don't even know what's happening, right? So while you might be looking at Venezuela and interdiction and stuff, you're not looking at Colombia, you're not looking at some of the surrounding regions who have land connections to Venezuela.
Right.
And all sorts of material can be coming through there from those very same proxies.
Right.
So they don't really have a full view of the Venezuelan situation. And while they're doing like spy missions and stuff from Trinidad and from around very close to the Venezuelan border, the Venezuelans are engaging in electromagnetic warfare and jamming facilities. So they're not, both sides aren't getting a full view of what's taking place. And this is having an effect on Curacao, it's having an effect on Brazil, it's having an effect on Trinidad and Tobago and the surrounding airspace. And this is where we find ourselves in.
Wow. And thank you for that. We see that they are pursuing another oil tanker, which I guess they haven't had much luck quite yet securing. So let's just play this video clip. I believe this is the one here.
In about a year from now, we'll.
Oh, nope, that's the wrong one. Hold on 1 second. Let me just see if we can grab this other one. So they are actively trying to pursue the Bella 1 tanker. And what's going on with the pursuit of that? Why haven't they been able? Is it outrunning the U.S. Coast Guard?
Well, no, it's a big oil tanker. It cannot outrun the U.S. Coast Guard.
Okay.
However, typically what happens is when you're boarded by the U.S. Coast Guard, the protocol is for you to stop, right? They refuse to stop. Right. So what happens is that it becomes dangerous now for the U.S. Coast Guard assets like the helicopters and whatnot. They cannot continue with the mission to interdict the vehicle because one, either you move the helicopter out of the way because this thing is not stopping, right? Two, you move them out of the way, you keep your people on the ground, and then they're actually insurgents on the ship, and then they shoot up the people. It's too risky, right? So they aborted the mission, right, to interdict the ship, and they left it, and they're now pursuing it. Now, I don't know what the end goal is because it has now gone off into the Atlantic, and they're still in pursuit of it, but they really want the oil.
All right, so we've got the video now downloaded. This is the Bella 1 making news again.
Tonight, addressing the latest high-stakes chase off the coast of Venezuela, U.S. officials saying an oil tanker steered out of the Caribbean and into the Atlantic Ocean after the Coast Guard tried to seize it. ABC's Selena Wang following the president in Palm Beach.
Tonight, President Trump announcing the U.S. is still actively pursuing a sanctioned oil tanker that fled into the Atlantic Ocean after the Coast Guard tried to seize it on Sunday.
Yeah, we're actually pursuing it. Can you imagine? Because it came from the wrong location. It came out of Venezuela, and it was sanctioned.
According to a U.S. official, the tanker called Bella 1 was on its way to pick up oil in Venezuela and was not carrying cargo when the U.S. attempted to board. The ship was not flying a legitimate national flag, the official says, giving the Coast Guard legal authority to intervene. It marks the third time in less than 2 weeks that the U.S. has targeted oil tankers linked to Venezuela. The Trump administration ramping up pressure on the country's oil exports, the economic lifeline of President Nicolas Maduro's regime. Trump asked tonight, what is his goal with Venezuela?
What's your end game?
There's no answer. He can do whatever he wants. I mean, we have a massive armada formed, the biggest we've ever had, and by far the biggest we've ever had in South America. He can do whatever he wants. It's all right. Whatever he wants to do. If he wants to do something, if he plays tough, it'll be the last time he's ever able to play tough.
The president pressed again. Does he want regime change?
Is it a goal in Venezuela to force Maduro from power?
Well, I think it probably would. I can't tell that. That's up to him what he wants to do. I think it would be smart for him to do that. But again, we're going to find out.
And with tonight, President Trump also announced a new class of battleships named after himself as he moves to revamp the U.S. naval fleet. Trump claims that they'll be 100 times more powerful than any battleship ever built. With
Selena Wang for us tonight. We appreciate it.
And we see that he has made some sort of statement telling Venezuela not to play tough. So he expects Venezuela to give up, which is so interesting because that is not unlike, what I guess Russia did to Ukraine, just said to give up, don't fight us. And it's going to be okay. And I don't think from what we can see happening with the other countries, again, coming to stand by Venezuela's side, that's going to happen. They're not going to lay down and just take it.
It interestingly puts the U.S. in quite an interesting juxtaposition, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, you are telling Russia to stop its attempts to annex, Ukraine, but then also at the same time, because you're not really giving Ukraine the support anymore, you're also telling Ukraine to give up your territory, right? So you're speaking from both sides of your mouth, and then you're pursuing this regime change, the same thing that Vladimir Putin is doing in Europe. pursuing this regime change in Venezuela, are now trying to take over territory and then also indicate Greenland and all these different places are important for U.S. national security, and therefore it needs to come under your ambit. Panama as well. So this is a trend. I mean, yesterday you had former U.S. Secretary of State and CIA Director Mike Pompeo speaking about how important Venezuelan oil is. And in fact, he even went as far as to indicate that removing Venezuela's Maduro is critically important because it allows U.S. energy big giants to come in like Chevron and so on to take over and to rebuild the industry. So as you can see, for a lot of the U.S. Individuals from very high levels, both former and latter, they all have that same strategic objective, which is to get the oil under control. Because, and just to correct something earlier, Venezuela, just to correct a point that you made earlier, Venezuela doesn't really provide so much like on the global scale. They provide oil through what you call a shadow fleet, right? So with Iran, with Russia, they have these fleets of oil tankers that hide their actual destination. That when they start to get close to Venezuela, they slot in, they get the oil, they slot back out, they turn their stuff off, and these are the things that the U.S. is interdicting. They say only the sanctioned ones and so on, but Venezuela's economy has been stymied by U.S. sanctions historically. However, what is irking folks like Marco Rubio and stuff like that is that Venezuela is getting quite a lot of funds from the threat axis, right? Russia, China, and all these things. And so they want to start to block that, to squeeze the Maduro regime because the sanctions aren't really working. The same way the sanctions aren't really working with Russia, they're still continuing their campaign. And it was hoped that those US sanctions would cripple the Russian economy, as we were told so in the first couple of days of the thing, that these sanctions are crippling, they're going to stop the Russian regime, but it hasn't. Neither has it done the same to the Maduro regime. So in order to enforce that and to finally crush it, you need to take military force. You need to undermine the state. You need to allow for the CIA to run operations in Venezuela to try to destabilize the state. And then that's the situation that underpins all of this.
Right. Wow. Okay. So we have some commenters here saying that Havana Harbor is coming soon, which will change maritime transport and supply of goods and tariffs. Anthony says Russia and China is too far away to be effective to engage in any combat, which is interesting. So let's look at what Russia is doing, because I think, Anthony, you might be a little bit off there because Russia has ships in the region now. So here's what we know that Russia has been doing and how they're doubling down on both the political, diplomatic, and military front, as well as energy support for Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela. Number one, they've got diplomatic and political moves. So Vladimir Putin has recently called Nicolas Maduro to reaffirm support for his government, stressing solidarity with the people of Venezuela and backing Caracas against external pressures. Russian officials at the UN Security Council have actually condemned the U.S. sanctions, naval actions, and threats against Venezuela, framing them as violations of sovereignty and non-interference. On the military and security operations front, Moscow and Caracas have now signed security agreements that include cooperation of intelligence, counter-espionage, drone use, and broader defense assistance, with Russia saying that it is ready to provide advanced weapons and equipment to Venezuela's armed forces. Analysts also note that while Russia's resources are heavily tied up in Ukraine, it still uses military diplomacy exchanges and exercises with Venezuela to project presence in the U.S.'s backyard. Energy and economic support. Russia remains a key partner for Venezuela's oil sector through technology, joint ventures, and long-term energy cooperation frameworks that run at least through 2030, helping Caracas work around the U.S. sanctions and aging infrastructure. Russia's also backing. Russian backing also includes continued coordination on sanctioned oil exports, and Moscow publicly criticized U.S. tanker seizures and related sanctions as illegitimate. So as of right now, the Russian government is offering full support, evacuating some diplomats, their family members, etc., from Venezuela amid fears of possible U.S. military action in the region. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what, I think some of us are kind of stuck. And I'm glad that you talked about what warfare kind of looks like in this day and age.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, they're going to have to get on the ground. They're going to have to do certain things. So maybe in our minds, we're a little bit stuck on what that means and what that looks like in 2025 going into 2026.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I'm not, I haven't heard anyways about the Russian ships, bar the oil tankers and stuff. I'm not aware of that in the region, but I am aware of Russians sending spy ships and stuff around the United States and, you know, within Europe over the last few months. But more strategically, Russia isn't going to send any fighters to Venezuela. It doesn't serve them to do that. However, what they have done is they've sent the Wagner group across, and that was the name of the mercenary group that is tied to Vladimir Putin. It's often referred to as his private army, right? The Wagner group is some of the most vicious bunch of mercenaries that is funded by the Russian regime, and they are part and parcel of the folks who are helping prop up President Maduro with stuff, you know, and yeah, so that's really, you know, is quite a critical part of the conversation.
Irvin says, "What's wrong with these people, man? They all need to stay in the loop of current affairs, be warned, and take notes instead of criticizing. Not on a go get left behind. Then you all will be calling Cayman Road with Ish when Ish hits the fan." Listen, we're just trying to, as we have in the past, keep our people somewhat current on international affairs. Remember, even with the Ukraine situation, when that war started, we had experts here on the show talking about potentially what that has meant. The only thing that has surprised me about that war is how long it's gone on for, going on now into 4 years. I did not expect the Ukraine people to be able to hold off the Russians, quite frankly, for that long. But there you go. You can't always predict you know, how these things will work out in the end. So, you know, we've got to pay attention.
I mean, the war in Ukraine was supposed to be ended within 24 hours, right?
Exactly. That's what they thought. Yeah. Nigel has a good point. He says, "My concern is with the seizure of the oil tankers. What if one of them is sabotaged intentionally or otherwise, and there's an oil spill? Hello. Within the Caribbean region. Can you imagine the impact of the fragile economies of the Caribbean states who rely heavily on tourism? And the environmental impact would be catastrophic." This is a
Absolutely.
good point.
But actually, to Nigel's point, I want to extend that further. We are now bombing boats in the Caribbean region, some of whom are carrying oil, some of whom are carrying cocaine, arguably some of whom are carrying all sorts of narcotics and chemicals and whatnot. We are bombing that into the ocean that we feed off of. So the life, the ecology, and all of that is now seeping into the marine life. The fish probably being consumed with cocaine. What are we then putting into our bodies? And that is why this is so critical for us to understand what is taking place in our region. If it is true that you're bombing cocaine and other things out of the water, this is going into our water. Hundreds of millions of pounds or whatever of cocaine. Instead of you interdicting it, you're blowing it into the water. What effect is that having on our marine life and our ecology? That's a real concern. Are we now eating contaminated marine life?
Even thought of that. Wow. Yes. Good point. Okay. Delrid says America will destroy Venezuela if you let them. The U.S. is a rogue country. Ask for help off of Russia, off of China, and this behavior from the U.S. Must be stopped. Burnt Poultry says, I would say Germany and Japan were beneficial regime changes. They were rebuilt enough to take the reins, but of course, now fuel the global empire. Most are failures. When we were talking earlier about, U.S. Sort of successes when they've intervened in other countries. Anthony says that the Russian army is exhausted from Ukraine. He's no use to Venezuela. Trump is going into Venezuela. Will be a day trip to all inclusive resorts. So we think it's going to be easy. Anthony thinks it's going to be that easy to take Venezuela. Time will tell.
No, it's not. It's not. But so I mean, I think that's sort of
yes.
Yeah, I think what I would say though is, to kind of, bring the conversation together, is that the Caribbean is facing a moment where external pressure is unlike we've ever seen before, right? And in different situations, whether people are being, pressed to put a radar here or being threatened with visas there so that they can, capitulate to the U.S. foreign policies. We are seeing regional situations where we got to make choices, right? How do we align ourselves? And is being quiet going to further exacerbate problems? What is the narrative of the United States when a lot of people and tourists, coming to our region come from the United States? How are we choosing our battles wisely? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, and it is, for the vast majority of Caribbean islands, a very real economic vulnerability, right? And it's a converging of all these issues, right? That we have to, consider. So how CARICOM responds now is very, very important, because of course there are going to be those long-term effects, right? And as I was speaking to earlier, Wholeness has a chance to convene CARICOM and observer states and whatever states come together to talk about the security situation. When it concerns spillovers, that's where the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas can be invoked, just as Mrs. Pearce did so in 2013. You could demand clarity on the governments in the region that have signed security agreements, including his own, because he recently met with U.S. officials. So we could get some clarity on that. To understand the foreign military engagement as a whole and how that might impact, so that regional governments can be adequately apprised of the situation. And as CARICOM Chair, that is his responsibility. He has to reassert that consultation, of course, is mandatory according to the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas as it pertains to anything that can spill over into other states. Okay? It's not about punishing anybody. It's about ensuring that, you stop any unilateral action that becomes a new normal, that affects people's bottom line, that undermines tourism, that undermines the economies of our respective countries. Because if he doesn't act, right, this is going to essentially, engender a collapse of CARICOM, right? It is going to quietly lose meaning. And every state is then going to face their pressures alone. United we stand, divided we fall, right? And so when we're trying to determine whether we remain a credible, a stable region able to protect our collective interests, we have to consider whose prosperity, you know, we are depending on, I suppose, if that's the correct terminology. What happens elsewhere in the basin is going to still matter to each of us. So it's not about confronting anything or being more adversarial. It's about tempering ourselves down, speaking to each other, engaging in dialogue that is focused on taking the region out of this conflict, focusing on the security of our citizens who may invariably be impacted by death, right? Especially when our state in Trinidad and Tobago has been threatened, right, by one of the warring parties. Consultation, restraint is the kind of thing that we need right now in the region, right? And so I think that is where we can try to bring the conversation, and hopefully that, you know, despite all of the confusion, the trials and tribulations of this time that we find ourselves in, hopefully, just hopefully, we can find that glimmer of hope, that glimmer of peace that can, you know, go us into Christmas morning, being able to appreciate what that means for us in the Caribbean and Cayman Islands, so that we can have a peaceful and, of course, Merry Christmas.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and give a virtual round of applause to thank Mr. Pearce Robinson for joining us on the program today and sort of help us unpack the fast-moving dynamics between Venezuela, the United States of America, Trinidad and Tobago, and the wider Caribbean region, which includes ourselves. Pearce, your depth of experience in development, diplomacy, and governance reform really brought some clarity, I think, to this very complex issue, this complex regional moment that we are having at this particular time. As small developing nations such as ourselves, you know, we're trying to navigate what this means. We've got great power politics involved in the mix that are trying to protect their own interests and further their own interests. And what does that mean for all of us? So the insights that you shared today on energy security, CARICOM's role, and how the Caribbean can try to preserve its zone of peace as much as possible while engaging with these major powers has really given our audience, I think, a lot to reflect on and to think about. So thank all of you for your public contributions, your phone calls, your comments, the conversation, really taking this, you know, well far and beyond anything that I think surpassed my expectations for sure. We truly appreciate your time and your contributions, and wishing you, Pearce, a very Merry Christmas, and hopefully for everyone else, a peaceful Christmas as well. So we hope that this time is going to be filled with rest, good health, and meaningful moments for the people of the Caribbean, all the Caribbean countries in the region for sure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And likewise, thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And have a good
Take care.
Christmas. Merry Christmas.